In 70 years, catastrophe visited nearly every major city in the industrialized world. Chicago burned, San Francisco fell, Galveston drowned, Messina shook apart, Tokyo turned to ash. Each disaster was followed by massive reconstruction, elevation projects, grade raises, millions of cubic yards of fill pumped beneath suspended buildings. The official histories focus on the tragedy and the recovery, but buried inside the technical reports from those reconstruction commissions, available in municipal archives, historical society collections, engineering journals, is a different record. Stone chambers of unknown purpose, tunnel systems of indeterminate origin, foundations that predated the cities built on top of them. The question isn't what was rebuilt, it's what got buried when reconstruction moved on. Between 1850 and 1923, nearly every major city in the industrialized world was catastrophically destroyed and rebuilt. The timing is striking when you map it, chronologically. Not one city, not two, but a sequence: Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco, Galveston, Messina, Halifax, Tokyo. Each reduced to rubble within decades of the last. Each reconstructed on a scale that required opening the ground, excavating old foundations, and building modern infrastructure over whatever lay beneath. I spent months working through municipal archives, engineering journals, and historical society collections across North America and Europe. What I found wasn't a conspiracy. It was a pattern embedded in official documentation. Engineering reports describing discoveries that troubled the professionals who wrote them and never made it into the public record. Chicago, 1871. The Great Fire destroyed 3.3 square miles of the city center in 2 days. Temperatures hot enough to melt stone. Destruction so complete that in some areas nothing remained but fused glass and ash. The official cause was Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern in a deport, Coven Street barn, though investigators at the time noted that the fire's intensity and spread rate were difficult to explain by a single ignition point alone. But the fire itself isn't where the documentary record becomes interesting. It's what happened during reconstruction. Chicago made an unusual decision. Rather than rebuilding at the existing street level, the city implemented a massive elevation project, one that had actually begun before the fire, between 1855 and the early 1870s, raising large sections of the city between 4 and 14 feet. Entire buildings were lifted on jack screws. New foundations were constructed beneath them. The old street level was buried under imported fill and forgotten. The official explanation was sanitation. Chicago was built on swampland, prone to flooding and disease, and raising the street grade would allow modern sewer infrastructure to function properly. That explanation is practical. It makes engineering sense, except it doesn't account for what the elevation crews found when they began excavating. Engineering reports from the Chicago Board of Sewage Commissioners, dated 1873, contain references to foundation structures of unusual sophistication discovered during elevation work. The language is precise and careful, the way engineers write when they're uncertain how to classify something. Stonework inconsistent with known settlement-era construction. Recommend documentation before burial under new grade level. Several photographs preserved in the Chicago Historical Society archives show workers standing beside exposed stone foundations, not the wooden pilings and brick basements typical of 1830s and 1840s construction, but dressed stone blocks fitted without mortar, showing techniques more sophisticated than what was being built above them. The engineers noted this, they photographed it, and then they buried it under 4 to 14 feet of fill and moved on. San Francisco, 1906. The earthquake struck at 5:12 in the morning on April 18th, magnitude 7.9. But the earthquake wasn't what destroyed the city. The fires that followed burned for 3 days, consuming more than 80% of San Francisco. Heat intense enough to create firestorms, winds strong enough to lift debris, temperatures that turned sand into glass. The United States Geological Survey assembled a commission to document the disaster and assess reconstruction needs. The reports from that commission, available in USGS archives, contain observations that rarely appear in popular histories of the earthquake. In the financial district, where fires burned hottest and destruction was most complete, excavation crews exposed what the commission called complex subsurface architecture of indeterminate origin. One report, dated July 1906, describes tunnel systems and stone chambers beneath Market Street that do not correspond to any known municipal infrastructure or documented construction period. The engineering assessment noted that these structures were built with precision exceeding contemporary capabilities, and that their purpose cannot be determined from surviving documentation. The recommendation was documentation and further study. But reconstruction moved quickly. Federal disaster relief prioritized speed over archaeology. By 1908, the areas where these structures had been exposed were filled with concrete and new construction. The tunnels were sealed. The chambers were buried. The official reconstruction records make no further mention of them. Here is the objection that follows naturally from both cases. If there were older structures beneath these cities, where are the records? Where is the historical documentation? How could foundations of that sophistication exist without leaving written evidence of who built them and when? It's the obvious counter-argument, and it deserves a direct answer. The same fires that destroyed Chicago and San Francisco also destroyed their archives. The 1871 Chicago fire consumed the Historical Society and the County Records Building. The 1906 earthquake destroyed San Francisco's City Hall and most of its municipal records with it. When catastrophe hits a city, it doesn't selectively preserve the documents that would explain anomalous subsurface discoveries. It burns everything. And even when records survived, there is the question of what gets preserved and what gets discarded. Municipal archives prioritize legal documents, property records, tax assessments. Engineering observations about mysterious foundations discovered during sewer work don't make it into the permanent collection. They get noted in technical reports, filed in engineering department archives, and eventually lost when those departments reorganize or relocate. The absence of documentation doesn't prove the structures weren't there. It proves that documentation is fragile, especially when disasters are the mechanism that exposes what was buried, and the same disasters destroy the records that might explain it. The pattern becomes visible when you stop examining these disasters individually and start reading them as a sequence. Chicago, 1871. San Francisco, 1906. Galveston, 1900. Messina, 1908. Tokyo, 1923. Engineering reports from 5 cities, on 3 continents, in 4 languages, all using variations of the same language to describe what excavation crews found when reconstruction opened the ground. Origin unknown, predating known settlement, sophistication exceeding contemporary capacity. Recommend documentation before burial. This isn't scattered folklore assembled after the fact. This is documented pattern. Official technical reports produced by professional engineers who had no reason to coordinate their observations, and every professional reason to be precise about what they were describing. Galveston, 1900. The hurricane that struck on September 8th remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. 8,000 people killed in a single night. The storm surge reached 15 feet. It obliterated the island city so completely that survivors emerged to find the geography of the place had changed. Debris fields where streets had been, nothing recognizable in entire neighborhoods. The reconstruction decision was radical. Rather than abandon the island or rebuild at the same elevation, Galveston implemented what engineers called the grading. The entire city would be raised 17 feet. Over 2,000 buildings were jacked up on stilts. Dredges pumped millions of cubic yards of sand from the Gulf of Mexico to fill beneath them. The process took 10 years. Photographs from the Galveston Historical Foundation document this process in remarkable detail. Buildings suspended while fill was pumped beneath them, the old street level disappearing under imported sand. But in several photographs, visible in excavation areas before fill arrived, there are stone structures, foundations, walls, archways, construction that doesn't match the wooden buildings being raised above them. The Galveston Daily News, in scattered reports from 1900 to 1903, mentions workers discovering old stone construction during excavation. One article from 1902 describes chambers of fitted stone found beneath Avenue L. Origin unknown, sealed during grade operations. The article treats this as a curiosity, a footnote to the larger drama of reconstruction. But here is what troubles me about that footnote. Galveston was founded in 1836. That is 64 years before the hurricane. Every building, every foundation, every structure in that window should have been documented. Settlers kept records. The city had archives. So why were excavation crews in 1900 finding stone construction, whose origin was listed as unknown? Messina, Sicily, 1908. An earthquake on December 28th killed over 75,000 people and destroyed the city entirely. During reconstruction, Italian engineers documented discoveries that mirror what was found in San Francisco and Galveston almost precisely. Reports archived in the Messina Municipal Historical Collection describe megalithic foundations beneath medieval city structures, stone construction predating any known settlement period in the region. One engineer, Giuseppe Melli, wrote in his formal assessment that the foundation work revealed evidence of building techniques inconsistent with the historical timeline of Messina's development, and recommended archaeological survey before reconstruction proceeded. Messina was rebuilt within 5 years. The foundations were covered. Melli's recommendation was filed and not acted upon. Why does the consistency of this pattern matter? Because the language isn't drifting between cases. Engineers in Chicago, San Francisco, Galveston, and Messina, working independently in different decades under different institutional mandates, reached for the same descriptive categories: origin unknown, predating known, settlement, sophistication exceeding contemporary capacity. That consistency suggests they were encountering something genuinely similar beneath the rubble of cities that were, officially, founded in the 18th and 19th centuries. The forensic question is no longer whether these discoveries happened. The documentation proves they happened. The question is how they were handled, and why the handling followed the same pattern across every case. Consider the institutional structure of post-disaster reconstruction. These were not locally managed projects, controlled by residents who knew the ground. They were massive, centralized operations. After the 1906 earthquake, San Francisco's reconstruction was coordinated by a federal commission, with engineers brought in from across the country. Chicago's elevation project was managed by a specially created board of sewage commissioners, with authorities superseding local government. Galveston's grade raise was overseen by an appointed commission with powers that effectively suspended normal municipal governance during the project. After Messina's earthquake, reconstruction was directed by a national commission appointed from Rome. Tokyo's rebuilding following 1923 was managed by the Imperial Capital Reconstruction Board, a centralized authority created specifically for that purpose. Centralized reconstruction management means centralized control over documentation. A local engineer encountering an anomalous foundation might document it out of professional curiosity and leave the report in a municipal file where anyone could eventually find it. But when that report travels upward to a commission deciding what gets published and what gets classified as an internal technical matter, the public narrative can be shaped without anything being destroyed or falsified. The reports weren't censored, they simply weren't promoted. Public-facing reconstruction documents focused on progress, efficiency, and modernity, language of recovery. Technical reports describing structures of indeterminate origin or construction predating known settlement stayed internal, filed in engineering department archives, where only specialists conducting targeted research would ever encounter them. Until those archives were digitized, until historical societies made their collections available for remote access, until researchers began connecting fragments across cities and noticing that the fragments described the same thing. The mid-19th century also marked a fundamental shift in construction technology that created both opportunity and institutional cover. Before 1850, buildings were stone, brick, and timber, traditional masonry refined over centuries. After 1870, steel frame construction and reinforced concrete transformed what was structurally possible. Old buildings were genuinely obsolete. They needed replacement to support growing urban populations and new industrial demands. And if those buildings happened to sit on foundations that raised uncomfortable questions about historical chronology, replacement addressed that problem without anyone needing to acknowledge it explicitly. But replacement alone doesn't require burial. You can demolish an old building and construct a new one at the same elevation. Cities don't need to raise their street level by 10 or 15 feet, unless there is something at the old street level that the new grade will cover. The sanitation explanations are legitimate. 19th century cities struggled with flooding, disease, and inadequate drainage infrastructure, and raising street grades genuinely improved public health outcomes. But those explanations don't account for why the most sophisticated discovered structures were consistently the ones buried first. with the least study under the most fill. If we accept the engineering reports at face value, and there is no documented reason to dismiss the professional assessments of multiple, independent commissions across multiple continents, we are left with a question that the official historical timeline cannot comfortably absorb. Cities that we believe were founded in the 18th and 19th centuries were built on top of infrastructure that predates their supposed founding. Infrastructure sophisticated enough to trouble trained engineers. Infrastructure that was systematically buried during reconstruction following disasters that, in several cases, also destroyed the documentary records that might have explained what it was. The immediate response is to reach for misidentification. Perhaps the engineers were wrong. Perhaps what they described as anomalous was simply unusual but explicable construction from the early settlement period. But that objection requires dismissing consistent professional assessments from Chicago, San Francisco, Galveston, Messina, and Tokyo simultaneously. It requires every engineer who noted these discoveries to have made the same categorical error independently. The documentation doesn't support that conclusion. The more forensically consistent explanation doesn't require impossible technology or lost super-civilizations. It requires only that urban development in North America and Europe followed cycles that current historical narratives don't fully account for. Climate data from the early 19th century shows a period of significant and sustained cooling. The 1815 eruption of Tambora produced the year without a summer in 1816. But tree ring data and ice core samples suggest the cooling began earlier and lasted longer than a single volcanic event explains. Decades of suppressed growing seasons. Agricultural stress across multiple regions simultaneously. The kind of systemic pressure that strains complex societies, not through sudden catastrophe, but through slow, compounding failure. Population records from 1800 to 1850 show anomalies that the standard historical narrative attributes to epidemic disease. Multiple regions across North America and Europe show population decreases or prolonged stagnation during periods when early industrialization should have driven growth. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis certainly killed people during this period. But what if depopulation preceded the epidemics rather than resulting from them? What if cities were already contracting when disease arrived, making outbreaks more devastating precisely because the infrastructure supporting public health was already in decline? A declining population cannot maintain complex infrastructure. Hydraulic systems require constant attention. Stone buildings require repair. Urban networks, water supply, drainage, road maintenance, the accumulated technical knowledge of how a city functions, require specialists who understand the systems well enough to sustain them. When populations fall below the threshold needed to maintain that knowledge, infrastructure doesn't collapse catastrophically. It fails gradually. Water systems stop functioning. Buildings deteriorate without repair. Streets become impassable. Over decades, a sophisticated urban system can decay into ruins without war, without invasion, without any single dramatic event to mark its end. And when disaster eventually strikes a weakened, depopulated system, total collapse follows quickly, because there is nothing left to resist it. This pattern is not speculative. It is one of the most well-documented processes in archaeological and historical study. Roman aqueducts that functioned for centuries fell into disrepair within decades of the empire's administrative contraction, not because the engineering failed, but because the population capable of maintaining it dispersed. Mesopotamian irrigation systems that sustained agricultural civilization for millennia silted up when the populations managing them could no longer coordinate maintenance. Angkor Wat's hydraulic network, among the most sophisticated pre-industrial water management systems ever constructed, failed when Khmer civilization contracted, and the labor required to sustain it could no longer be organized. The mechanism is the same in every case. Complex infrastructure requires complex, stable societies to maintain it, and when those societies contract, the infrastructure contracts with them, gradually becoming ruins, then rubble, then buried foundation, then forgotten entirely. The same process could account for what engineers found beneath Chicago, San Francisco, Galveston, Messina, and Tokyo. A sophisticated urban civilization existing in the early 19th century or before, experiencing climate stress, agricultural failure, population decline, and the slow systemic collapse that follows. abandoning or contracting to the point where infrastructure could no longer be maintained. Cities becoming ruins over decades, new settlers arriving later and building on the ruins without understanding what the foundations beneath them represented. When the Great Chicago Fire struck in 1871, when San Francisco's earthquake hit in 1906, when Galveston's hurricane arrived in 1900, they were not simply destroying 19th-century cities. They were tearing open the ground and briefly exposing what those cities had been built on top of. Foundations that predated the official settlement timeline, infrastructure that the current inhabitants had not built and could not explain. Faced with that exposure, reconstruction commissions made a practical choice. They could stop, conduct archaeological surveys, and attempt to understand the historical implications of what excavation crews were uncovering. Or they could prioritize speed, rebuild functioning cities for living populations, and treat the discoveries as engineering curiosities to be noted in technical reports and covered under new construction. They chose the latter, not because of coordinated suppression, but because their mandate was reconstruction and people needed homes. The engineers who wrote the reports were doing their professional duty by documenting anomalies. The commissions that buried those anomalies under new foundations were doing theirs. Our own cities are complex systems, dependent on supply chains, specialist technical knowledge, and continuous maintenance that most inhabitants don't understand and couldn't replicate. Our infrastructure requires professionals who know how it functions. Our historical records are increasingly stored in digital formats, vulnerable to loss in ways that previous generations of paper archives were not. When systems fail, and history suggests they always eventually do, future populations won't necessarily inherit the knowledge of what we built. They will find our ruins. They will marvel at the engineering. They will debate whether the civilization that produced it could really have existed. And eventually, they will build on top of what we left behind, exactly as we are building now on top of what came before us. The reports from Chicago, San Francisco, Galveston, Messina, and Tokyo are sitting in municipal archives, historical society collections, and university libraries. They are not classified. They are not hidden. Anyone can request them. Anyone can read the descriptions of structures that predate known settlement, chambers of indeterminate origin, stonework showing sophistication exceeding contemporary capacity. The documentary evidence is fragmentary, scattered across collections that were never designed to preserve engineering curiosities, separated by language and geography, and the institutional decisions of reconstruction commissions that prioritized speed over inquiry. But it is there. Enough survived to establish the pattern. Enough photographs remain to show what was found. Enough reports exist across enough cities to make coincidence an insufficient explanation. The 70-year window between 1850 and 1923 was a brief period when disasters were frequent enough and reconstruction methods were documented carefully enough that the pattern became visible. Before that window, records are too sparse. After it, cities became too densely built for disasters to expose deep foundations. What remains is a concentrated period of documentation, showing that when the ground was opened, what was found didn't always match what the official timeline predicted would be there. The question that emerges from those reports isn't whether to believe in lost civilizations or impossible technology. It's whether we're willing to take seriously what professional engineers documented when reconstruction forced them to look beneath the cities we thought we understood, and consider what it means that the answer, in nearly every case, was the same. Something old, something sophisticated, something that got buried again because reconstruction couldn't wait and historical inquiry was never the priority. The reports survived. The ground did not.